This is commerce and carbon reduction. So we're going to talk about issues related to really reducing carbon footprint in the transportation sector, reducing the carbon footprint of businesses which fit together, and also the role that investors can play in bringing about a society where companies are rewarded who take the opportunity to reduce their carbon footprint in an effective way, and opportunities investors have to invest in those companies. And there's some really exciting stuff there. So last block of presentations, and our first speaker in that block is Matt Curtis. Matt has an MBA from the University of Virginia. I didn't mispronounce that incorrectly, even though they're the rival of my alma mater, William & Mary. He served for, I believe, 19 years, originally enlisted, and then as an officer in the Navy, and retired about 2 years ago, and we're honored to have him with us. And he's going to be doing a capstone that's very, very relevant to the dominating the news right now, COVID-19, and something that's impacting all of our lives and all of our postures and some of our eating habits. It's mine. Telework. So Matt, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Corey. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hope everybody had a good break. So I'll try to keep us on schedule here, and we'll just jump right into it. So we're going to talk about telework and kind of the impacts on emission reduction goals and the climate, and that's the focus of my presentation. Here's the agenda. We talk a little bit about the capstone background. How did I get there? We're going to talk about telework, understanding what that's about, some history of it. I'll talk about the case study I did, which is kind of my area of focus, and then how the results connect to the emission reduction targets for San Diego and California. So emission shutdown. So what's happened during the shutdown? And we've all been a part of it, but we've seen it 70% year-over-year decline to one study. The economist said 1 to 2% decline annually, and the largest drop of emissions since World War II, according to the IEA. That's all great, but as we've seen in the past, crashes lead to short-term reductions, but then emissions tend to rise again. So looking in California, what does this have to do with transportation? The largest portion of emissions are transportation in California, 41%. And you can see over the past 17 years, or from 2000 to 2017, basically vehicle emissions have stayed pretty much stable. And actually passenger vehicle accounts for about 28% of those overall emissions. And then how does this apply to San Diego? So San Diego, it's even a bigger portion for transportation, 55%. So a lot of emissions are due to vehicle emissions. And in San Diego alone, 84% of people commute to work by themselves, and 88% work outside of the home on a regular basis. So, so what about this project? So I wanted to try to find something, a company that's in the intersection of San Diego, intersection of COVID, that's purpose for all this telework and the shutdown, and in the intersection of kind of working remotely. And so I chose Illumina, company here in San Diego, headquarters in San Diego, and they're part of the COVID research, but they also have a lot of teleworking employees during this shutdown. So this is their headquarters here in San Diego, and they have manufacturing here, office spaces here, distribution here, laboratory spaces here. And one thing you notice, there's about 4,000 employees, roughly, give or take, here at San Diego headquarters, and it's a multinational corporation. They have facilities around the world. But during the shutdown, you see the footprint for a lot of the parking spaces. So when majority of the staff are not commuting, then you're saving a lot of CO2 emissions. So what's the impact, and how can we extrapolate that impact to maybe San Diego, other industries, and then California as well? So a little bit on telework history. 1970s, Jack Niles, NASA employee, wrote a book about telework. And it's kind of like the start of this telework. It began in the environmental movement. 90s legislation, 2010 legislation, a lot of growth, early adopters in the 90s. 40% of IBM's workforce was teleworking by the year 2010, saving the company millions of dollars annually. And even here in San Diego, Sharp Healthcare had a goal in 2011 of 1,000 employees in a new teleworking program. But then after that, support stalled out. So in 2012, we had some of the early adopters basically deciding that they were going to abandon their programs, IBM, HP, and then in 2015, also more Best Buy, Reddit, et cetera. They said, nope, we're not going to do it anymore. And in 2018, even the federal government started pulling back. But still, you saw kind of overall telework numbers rise to, depending on where you look, between 31 and 43%. And that's for folks who were teleworking a portion of the time, so not full-time teleworkers. And then we had the COVID crisis, okay? And so we have a lot of shutdowns there, but companies are forced to embrace telework. In fact, you could even argue that the fact that we've been able to maintain productivity in society with all the shutdowns we've had is because of the advances in technology and because so many companies were able to adapt to teleworking. 34% shifted in March in the United States. And then another global workplace analytics did a survey, 60% of employees who work in cubicles would give up their cubicle space to work from home. 50% of office workers who have their own office would give that up. And 70% of CFOs want to move forward with telework in the future post shutdown. Well, what does that mean? You need to be successful with it as well. So it's nice to have a goal, but it needs organizational support. So it starts with the culture at the top and supporting telework. It's not going to work if you don't have that kind of upper management support, but not just upper management, also support throughout the organization. Not every job type is telework friendly, let's just say. So it varies by occupation, by industry, by employer size. Illumina at their headquarters has a huge manufacturing contingent there, but they also have a lot of overhead there at their headquarters. So a lot of the folks are able to telework, not everybody, but not every job lends itself to it. You also have employee attributes, and the number one factor there from some of the research studies is desire. So desire of the employee to actually telework. Do they want to do it? They also have to have self-discipline to know how to get up, start their work every day. It's time management. They also have self-awareness to be able to say, no, I need to stop and I need to actually do other things when my work is done. You have to take time for yourself. And then they need experience. So what does that environment look like? It's the same environment you would have in your workplace. So it's the same resources, same equipment. That's what the most successful companies have found. So if it's the latest technology, standardized technology, take that technology home. If it's multiple monitors, if it's a adjustable desk, all of that, and distraction-free with things like sound-canceling headphones. Organizational processes, this boils down to training, expectation setting, and communication. So these are the telework success factors and what makes companies successful when they engage in telework. So a little bit about Illumina. So you have some background numbers there on the left. Like I said, San Diego HQ has about 4,000 employees. The average commute time in San Diego County average commute distance rather, is about 32.7 miles. And then with about 415 grams of CO2 equivalent per mile here in San Diego. And that's numbers that San Diego's using. I estimate they had about 15% full-time teleworkers prior to, and this is an assumption based on the case that they're going to have about 45% after. They released their first CSR report this year. The company has a lot of great goals, including reducing CO2 emissions by 2030. And then you can see on the top right, these are their emissions from their CSR report for globally and then for the Americas. Almost 20,000, and the Americas includes San Diego headquarters. But I wanted to point out that this is scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So why is that important? Because the greenhouse protocol is basically like the global standard for reporting emissions. And in the United States, EPA has a couple of different metrics. They tend to revolve around a baseline of 25,000 metric tons of CO2 annually. But there's 3 things you need to report. So if you're required to report, you're required to report scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 1 is direct emissions from sources that are owned by the company, like facilities and vehicles. Scope 2 are from facilities that the company uses, like energy for air conditioning, heating, et cetera, but they don't actually own the energy producer. So that's scope 2, 1 and 2, direct and indirect. Scope 3, indirect, encompasses kind of like the life cycle of the service or product. Upstream activities, downstream activities, shipping, leased assets, and you can see kind of the other things on here. But why is that important? That's important because employee commuting tends to fall into scope 3, and scope 3 tends to be a larger portion when companies do account for it. Scope 3 makes up, I think, 5.5 times usually what their scope 1 and scope 2 are. So why would a company want to report scope 3 emissions? Up here, you'll see some business goals on the left and opportunities and risks on the right. And these can be found in the scope 3 accounting and reporting standards from the GHG protocol. But how would so a company is deciding to do this, how would they go about doing it? They'd go to Chapter 7 of this reporting standards for Scope 3, and they'd look at specifically for commuting. These are the 3 ways it can be calculated. But you need some great data to be able to do 1 and 2, which I didn't have. So I used something similar to the average data method, which is the 3rd method for calculating commuting emissions. Why is this important? Well, this is kind of the elephant in the room in this article, is what it was called. Scope 3 emissions, and which companies are and which companies aren't reporting. And about 1/3 of the top largest 200 companies in the world don't report Scope 3. So it's a big deal, and the EU is starting to require Scope 3 reporting. So for the case study, these were my methods. I wanted to look at kind of the environmental benefits. I wanted to look at some cost savings, so some ROI for the company. I wanted to look at some individual benefits as well. These are the triple bottom line, so to speak. And then I wanted to basically compare the emissions to the climate action goals for San Diego, California, and say, what can we learn from this? And if this paradigm is shifting, how might it impact our climate goals? And what we're doing to get there. So there's a lot of calculators out there online. There's a lot of companies that actually do this for a living. So there's resources out there to do this, but I wanted to kind of run my own calculations. So I made some key assumptions about distance time. I've talked to some of these things already. Talking about CO2 equivalent per mile, public transportation rates. I wanted to look at electric vehicle rates. I made some assumptions about electric vehicle usage, et cetera. And then these were based on kind of best available information out there, whether it was the Illumina's 10K or whether it was their Q1 phone call about their earnings, et cetera. So, or whether it was Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, et cetera. I tried to use the best sources to get these information. And then some of the other things that are important, I think, to look at are things like air travel emissions for full-time work from home employees who actually travel back and forth. Total vehicle mile traveled impact. Is there a reduction in overall vehicle mile impact to people who telework? Electricity usage, daily electricity usage in the home, and how that matches up to maybe distributed energy resources and solar on the home and that kind of thing, kind of matching the demand with the supply, etc. So here's what I found out. Through my calculations, I discovered that at about a 45% work from home rate, which is what I talked about, which is about 1,800 employees roughly. And that's a work from home equivalent. That doesn't mean 1,800 employees are working from home 100% of the time. That's the equivalent rate. The company saves almost 2,500 metric tons of CO2 annually, which is a good chunk. I also calculated that the company would save from leasing costs about $13 million a year. And so a lot of things go into these savings. Leasing costs, increased production, you have increased retention, etc. This is a little high. Some online calculators are actually calculating less, but this is what I found. And then for the individual, if you're not commuting every day to work, you get an average of 9 days back of commuting time, and you save $1,000. Now, of course, that's going to vary depending on fuel costs, etc., and traffic, and so forth. But these are quite impressive gains for just one company. So extrapolating that out. So California and San Diego have reached their 2020 emissions goals. They're doing a great job. 2030 goals are more difficult, especially for California, because they need to reduce at twice the rate that they've been reducing over the past 10 years for the next decade. So California really needs to reduce more. And using some of the Bureau of Labor Statistic data, matching up those industries that are telework friendly and extrapolating that out, this is what I found. So San Diego right now, if they reduce on track with what they've been reducing at the same rate, they're going to get to their 2030 target, and it's going to be about 10%. California, on the other hand, the latest estimates are that California is going to be about 25 million metric tons short for their 2030 target. But using this kind of data and my estimates and extrapolating this out, what I found is, and depending on where you start, anywhere between 22% or 32% of that gap can be cut to increase teleworking. And if there's kind of a paradigm shift, and if we're able to capture this momentum for teleworking, and that's just for people going back and forth to work every day. That's not talking about other opportunities in other industries. Kaiser CEO basically said that during the shutdown, 80% of their visits were telemedicine, and they intend to increase their telemedicine after the shutdown, 30 to 40%. So you're going to get some savings there from people who are not just commuting to work, but commuting to other kind of services. There's also education considerations. The UCSD chancellor even admitted that there's some opportunities out there for students that they might not otherwise be considering And there may be some changes in education, and having kids myself and having to deal with kids at home. It's been challenging, but it's also been it's been good, I think, in some ways. I can talk about that later. And then in the entertainment industry, taking a huge hit, $160 billion estimate hit over the next 5 years, but they're making some changes. They're being forced to adapt shortly into what would have been maybe a 5-year period of innovation. Apple acquired NextVR, and there's some good things happening in the entertainment industry, releasing video on demand, etc. So you might see some other changes there. So what does this mean for policy recommendations? So my recommendations would be to promote things like telework-friendly community design, neighborhood construction design, rededicate space, as some municipalities, cities are doing around the world now, for pedestrian usage, conduct cost-benefit analysis of transportation capital improvement projects versus work-from-home kind of incentive projects. I also think that public sustainability folks should try to incentivize corporate telework. What does that look like? Does that mean, tax implications, et cetera? Potentially, does that mean incentivize them to report scope 3? Potentially as well, but incentivize corporate telework because we receive the benefit locally and everyone does. Excuse me. I also think you want to try to incentivize remote workers. There are places like Nebraska, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Vermont, where they incentivize remote workers to actually move to the local area and work there, and they give them bonuses, grants, et cetera, to help contribute towards a home office. So incentivize remote workers to come live in the area. Incentivize remote consumption of services. Try to eliminate some of the barriers that have been temporarily suspended for, like telemedicine, for example. So if we can incentivize those things, eliminate some of those barriers, then we can promote that type of activity, and then we all benefit from reduced vehicle travel. And then I think maximize public sector work as well. And so if that's, at the public sector, the government employees, maximize that where it makes sense, of course. And like I said earlier, not every job is suited for working from home. But anyway, those are some of the policy recommendations. So I want to thank the entire CSP staff, especially Corey. I know this has been a bit of a sprint for this project, much like this presentation itself was a bit of a sprint. I think Corey had to put up with kind of a lot from me to do that, to get this project done, as I kind of shifted from my previous project here in the last 6 to 8 weeks, trying to capitalize on what was happening out there. And so I saved 22 miles not commuting for this presentation today. So that's a bonus. I'll take that as a win. And somebody said also that telework has been like a failure of imagination. And I don't know if I agree with that fully, because sometimes seeing the future is a lot different and a lot easier than understanding the way to get there and how to shape the path to get there. And so I think we're kind of reawakening to what telework can be and what the impact of telework can have on kind of our climate action goals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Great job, Matt.
With some questions. Risa?
Excellent. So yes, we've got 2 questions, or actually 3 questions that have come through in the chat box. So
Okay.
The first is from Larry, who his first ask is, what are employers' resistances to telework? And then his second is San Diego's county's central problem, car dependency and lack of public transport to dense business zones.
So the first part, I'll take the first part. It tends to be culture, I think, and I think sometimes it has a connection with the business cycle. So I don't know this for sure. This is just speculation for me, but I think sometimes, managing is hard and supervising is hard. And I think that it's difficult when you have remote employees to kind of like, how do I evaluate those folks and what they're doing, and do I trust them? And so one of the key factors for employers is they need to really trust their people. If you can't trust your folks while they're working from home, how do you trust them while they're working in the office either? So you probably shouldn't have hired that person, or they probably shouldn't be working for you if you can't trust them. So that's some of the biggest factors as well. The costs about equipment and technology and stuff like that, those are really less of a factor. Wi-Fi is less of a factor. I think one of the latest pollings done during this is that Wi-Fi is at the bottom of the list of barriers for teleworking access, at least in the United States. It's a bigger issue in places like India or Pakistan, for example. There's a couple studies done there about Wi-Fi access. So what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry. I know Larry.
No worries. So second part of the question asks, is San Diego County's central problem car dependency and lack of public transportation to dense business zones?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. I don't know what San Diego's central problem is. Certainly, transportation makes up 55% of their overall footprint, right? So it is fairly spread out. Could be. Yeah, it could be. That might be part of the problem. I know there's people working very hard on that. It's sustainability with San Diego and working towards that. So I don't really have a good answer for you there, Larry, but could very well be.
Excellent. And last question is coming in from Mackenzie, an alumni from last year. And she says, hey, Matt, nice work. Have you presented your results to any San Diego government agencies, particularly SANDAG, which is pursuing telework as a solution in reaching climate goals?
No, I haven't. I thought they were all tuning in. I wasn't, I thought I was going to be presenting that now. No, I haven't. Hi, Mackenzie, how are you? No, I haven't. It hasn't been part of the solution traditionally. And I think that, and it's not in any way to kind of critique the folks that are doing great work as far as sustainability or trying to reduce the overall emissions. I think that it's just been an opportunity that was kind of overlooked. And so I think we're kind of reawakening to what this opportunity and kind of the magnitude it can really have. And you're seeing some shifts out there in industries. And so I think that that's really valuable. But SANDAG, that would be kind of like, and I read some of their SANDAG studies, and they do mention telework a little bit. But it's not really a focus, at least not from what I've seen. And that was kind of connected to my first policy recommendation of really try to make things more local. And so that people who are working from home can, some of the benefits people are seeing is more exercise, et cetera, more local, getting in touch with neighbors. So there are some benefits to it that aren't just saving time or saving money, that kind of thing. So hope I answered your question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciated the time and effort you put into this and enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks.